the thunder, and it really seemed apocalyptic.
On this episode of the Stinking Albatross Podcast.
And her mother said, well, if I'm suffering a lot or I don't have mental capacity, then I might say something really mean and hateful, and then no one would love me. And my friend responded, Mom, you already say mean and hateful things, and I still love you.
I just like the doctors always suggesting it or even coercing is just so awful.
I can't believe that those people are actually in healthcare.
Normally, with journalistic standards and reporting, you would not glorify and sensationalize suicide.
Today's episode is brought to you by LaRosse Media Incorporated. They make professional videos to fit any budget, so next time you need a commercial, promo, or corporate video, think LaRosse. Check them out at larossemedia.com. Hello and welcome to the Stinking Albatross Podcast. My name is Alissa Galobe, and I'm here once again in person with my partner in crime, Scott Hayward.
It's our annual podcast together in person once a year.
It's so weird to do I feel like we should be sitting across from each other.
Right.
Like, it's so weird to be like, how's it going?
Yeah, looking at one another. And we have to keep our heads relatively close because we're sharing
It's very weird.
an earpiece so we can hear our guest today.
Yeah, speaking of guest, we do have one. Her name is Amanda Achtman. Thank you so much for joining us, Amanda. You're calling in from Ottawa, correct?
That's right.
Awesome. So Amanda works for the Canadian Physicians for Life on ethics, education, and cultural engagement. Determined to protect human life, Amanda's current project is preventing euthanasia and encouraging hope through the Dying to Meet You project. So let's just start with the Dying to Meet You project. Can you explain a little bit about what it is and what inspired you to start it?
Sure. Well, some years ago when I was working on Parliamentary, Bill C-7 came up, which was the attempt to expand euthanasia on the basis of disability and mental illness. So fewer than 5 years after the initial introduction of the euthanasia law in 2016 that legalized euthanasia nationwide, the government was already eroding all of those safeguards that were deemed essential at the outset. So I was working with a member of parliament and actually with many of the members of parliament who were trying to prevent this legislative expansion, to give voice to those with mental illness who wanted to speak out, to give voice to Indigenous Canadians, to palliative care doctors, to a whole range of kind of underrepresented voices in the discussion. So we sought to amplify those voices, thinking that for those for whom this concerns them the most, they deserve a platform. And we know this law was being expanded right during the pandemic, a time where everyone was exceptionally vulnerable and perhaps not paying close attention to this. So in the midst of all of this and realizing that, unfortunately, Bill C-7 was going to pass, the Liberal government was going to expand euthanasia to those with disabilities and with mental illness as a sole condition, which, as a brief aside, was passed but has since been staved off in the 11th hour, shortly before being ushered in and set to actually take effect. But that is the law that passed, and that is the law that would still come into effect if not for these delays that have been stalling it. So in the midst of all of that, I wondered, what is going on in our country? And what can I do to take some personal responsibility for this crisis of our inability as a culture, as a society, to contend with things like suffering and death? And so that's when I just made a New Year's resolution, really as my own personal catharsis. And I started a blog called Dying to Meet You, and it was at dyingtomeetyou.ca. And simply, as my personal New Year's resolution, I resolved to blog about death and dying every day for a whole year, which I did. And I did it in a way that was cultural, that was oriented toward meaning making and hope. And that really became the impetus for what developed into what is now a broader cultural project of preventing euthanasia and encouraging hope across Canada and really beyond, through writing and speaking, releasing short films to, again, give people a voice who normally would otherwise be underrepresented, and also community events.
Yeah, and Amanda, like you and I have spoken at a couple different pro-life conferences already this year. And at the SPLA conference, Saskatchewan Pro-Life Association conference and AGM up in Saskatoon earlier, I believe in April of this year, I finally got to, I've been dying to hear you talk about your Dying to Meet project and some of the stories that you were sharing. And I found them to be very effective and very profound. And it's kind of weird, Alissa, because for those of us that work full time in the pro-life movement, sometimes, unfortunately, some, not all of these stories, whether it be about abortion or assisted suicide, they don't quite hit us the same because we're in it day to day. But Amanda, I've found a lot of the stories that you had to share to be profound, and it did hit me quite hard. Which I think is a very good thing. You were speaking in your previous answer about giving platform to those who are negatively affected, in some ways I would even argue targeted, by the C7 legislation, some of it which has been staved off by me. That's just a delaying tactic. And I think one of the best examples is the video that you did with Roger Foley, which is a man with disabilities, correct me if I'm wrong, based out of London, Ontario, I believe, who had been offered many times from healthcare professionals the option of assisted suicide. The video that you did with him on Twitter, I would argue, exploded. It has over 800,000 views. From that specific campaign and other campaigns like it, can you tell us some of the positives that have come out from that, whether it be converting people from who were very pro assisted suicide, and they watch a video like this and they kind of change their minds, or perhaps other politicians coming on board? What have been some of the outcomes from doing some of this excellent work that you've been doing?
I would say first and foremost, the reason why I do it, and I think the primary benefit, is to elevate the voices and perspectives of those who, as a friend I met the other day put it very aptly, are being devalued to death. And so what is the opposite of devaluing someone to death? It's valuing them to life. It's giving them a chance to have a platform, to be an influence. And so the first and foremost, that itself is its own fruit and benefit. When someone who is, in a certain sense, relegated to the periphery is then given a platform, that I think is the antidote to devaluing to death. And then next, subsequently, for the impact, I think a real basis for hope in this work is the kind of coalition building that happens when we come around the value of human life, and when we come around contending with the mystery of our own fragility and vulnerability. Sometimes those words are controversial in certain circles, but I think when we say about them, about those words, we, rather than thinking in an us and them way, it becomes a basis for greater human solidarity, which is so much needed. And so, for example, with Roger Foley's story, the kinds of people who were retweeting it and commenting on it don't vote the same way. They don't go to the same places. They don't have the same friends. And I marveled at the way that this message, his message in his words, was cutting through the polarization and bringing people together in defense of the value of life. To me, this is just so uplifting to see. And then there were also those whose minds were changed, who admitted it in their reflections on the video. Some people said, I was for it, and now this gives me pause. Because how can you listen to a story like Roger, who, when he goes into the hospital, is offered suicide assistance, when we know that we would likely be offered suicide prevention? How do we live with that reality in our society? It's, as you do, advocating at the beginning of life. Likewise, through all of our lives, we deserve protection, and sometimes those most in need of it are the least likely to have that protection, which is why we all do what we do in the pro-life movement.
I actually have a follow-up question to that, because there was something interesting. I remember, Amanda, at a couple of the presentations that we were at together, you had I found to be in a very effective, eye-opening slide, and the reasons, and I don't know if it was a Canadian study or not, but the reasons as to why people choose assisted suicide. And it's not what I thought. Correct me if I'm wrong, Amanda, but I think it was over 70 or 80% of the time, people said it was their fear of not being able to kind of do like everyday things. If I don't know if you can extend it to being somewhat of a burden. So I thought that was really interesting. I was wondering if you could talk about that, but a little bit on the flip side, have you, when you're doing these campaigns, like the video of Roger Foley, or going and speaking with people, or just kind of going through comments, or maybe people are emailing you or direct messaging you on social media or something like that, for those who, let's say were in favor of assisted suicide at one point in time, maybe, 8 or 9 years ago when it first came up, through the Carter decision and through the first legislation under the Liberals, to now being against it either completely or much more so. Was there like a common theme from them of like, was it a specific breaking point? Was it a specific thing that made them think like, okay, you know what? I don't think I'm in favor of this much anymore.
Okay, great questions. I'll start with the first one on the reason why, according to people's own admission, people are asking for euthanasia. The government has year after year produced an annual report.
So this is the federal government in Canada?
The federal government,
okay.
Yes. It's the MAID annual report. So there's the first, second, third, and fourth annual reports. And each year there's a lot of data put out by the federal government, by Health Canada, around the euthanasia program and policy. And what I find particularly interesting is that people, by their own admission, there's a list of possible reasons that lead people to request euthanasia. And the number one reason that leads people to request it is a loss of ability to engage in meaningful life activities. That's the top one, loss of ability to engage in meaningful life activities. The next is an inability to perform the daily activities of personal care and daily life. According to some of the euthanasia doctors in Canada who speak with so much kind of enthusiasm for euthanasia, they say the main reason driving their patients is autonomy and control. And in fact, those can go together, a desire for autonomy and control, and a sense that meaningfulness in life is lost when you don't have it. And so what really interests me is how these topics touch on all the most deeply human questions. What is the meaning of life? What is the nature of suffering? What is the value in relationships? What is my value when I cannot produce or achieve? Because this euthanasia conversation touches all of those questions, that's why it interests and animates me. Not as a polemical topic, not as a culture war, but really as a key to grappling and contending with these questions that are not outside of us, they're in us. And that brings me to the second part about when people start to pay attention or to have concern. When they realize that someone who they would want outside of the eligibility of euthanasia is going to be killed. That's the wake-up call. Because unfortunately, there are, in many people's minds, a category of persons who maybe deserve not to exist. Now, they may say that would be on the basis of their consent, or that would be on the basis of them having a very egregious condition, whatever it may be. But by such persons also have a category of persons who they think ought to exist, or it's good that they exist. My contention is that it's good for everyone to exist. And part of fundamental human equality is that we advocate for everyone's life, including the people who are inconvenient, perhaps especially those who are kind of inconvenient. And so I think this is what's waking people up when they realize, oh, that's not what I thought MAID or euthanasia entails. That's not who I thought or expected it to concern. But now in Canada, we know that 5% of all deaths are euthanasia. In some parts of British Columbia and Quebec, it's up to 7%. So there's not a single place that I've spoken this past year, including churches, where someone has not come up to me at the end of the talk and told me a personal story of someone in their life who has been euthanized, or who has told me that they are going through the process of having someone in their life strongly considering it, or who's been approved for it. So this is touching all of us. And so few people even have an outlet to speak about it. So maybe later I can share some of the stories about my casual conversations with Airbnb hosts and Uber drivers, bringing up these topics that are not our everyday conversation and yet sorely need to be had.
Yeah, a few years ago when C7 was going through, I was actually asked to get letters or sign a petition or something by a MP to different church groups. And so I myself was at my hometown in Sarnia, and I was asked to speak to this group at a Catholic church, and it was maybe 10 or 15 elderly women. And I think maybe 2 of them there were against assisted suicide. Like, I just went in assuming that they would all be against it, but they were all arguing. Some people, like, their husbands, it had happened to their husbands. It was just like a very eye-opening experience for me in a negative way. So I think that, I think it's really good to speak at the churches, because we just assume that, they're going to be on the same side, when that is not at all the case with this topic. With regards to your videos, your Dying to Meet You videos, where do you find these people? Like, do they email you? Do you see them in the news and then you contact them? Like, how do you set up these videos?
It's certainly a mix. For example, the first video I did of the year with a woman named Christine, she is in my hometown. And so as soon as I returned to Calgary after my studies in Rome and decided to spend this past year traveling across Canada, hearing stories and making videos, of course, everyone said to me, "Oh, you prevent euthanasia and encourage hope. You have got to meet Christine. Christine has a tattoo that says, 'Don't euthanize me.'" So I thought, well, maybe I'll email her. Maybe I'll call her. Well, turns out she doesn't use email, and she's in a retirement residence. And so finally, I met her with some friends of hers at a Tim Hortons for our first meeting, and then step by step we became friends. And visit after visit, she shared more and more. But in the video that was on film, she actually shared much more than she had ever shared with me previously, one-to-one. Even as our relationship had grown, there were some things she had not talked about that were the most poignant parts. And I think when the camera starts, someone such as Christine realizes now's the chance to say my story, to say my piece. And there's this kind of opening in expression that is so beautiful to watch. I often find that when I would interview people for my blog, or when I would interview people even kind of socially as an excuse to have a conversation with them, sometimes that's an opening. "Oh, I want to interview you." And not everything is published. Not everything becomes a film. A lot of these conversations are really just to form my character and to nourish my own soul. And so sometimes people in speaking with me would very often say things like, "I never knew I had such a story." That is so beautiful. And I think almost everyone in our life could come to a kind of realization in sharing their story with someone else. I've never told it in quite that way. And the reason is because each of us has the capacity to draw out a person's story uniquely. The way that you listen to someone's story is going to change the actual telling of it. That's powerful. And I think that's another way in which we can see each other's value more profoundly.
Yeah, I will say this though, Alissa, that I have seen Amanda do this live, sitting in a room with her, working with a politician who I'll rename, or I'll keep nameless for the time being. And it was for a leadership race for the Conservative Party of Canada. And Amanda, with a few other different people who specialize in communications, which is most definitely not me, was speaking about this politician, this leadership candidate, specifically about the topic of abortion. And then Amanda, more than anyone else, was able to draw out of this politician this amazing, powerful, personal story that they had about their own kind of abortion experience, or they didn't actually have an abortion, but experience with, people kind of trying to impose that upon them. And I remember watching that, I was like, wow, like she was able to draw like this, I'm going to call it gold, right? Like kind of out of nowhere. So Amanda, I think you have...
I'm scared. Like, what are you going to draw with me?
Yeah. you have this, I know you say like everyone can do this, and you're probably not wrong, but specifically you have that gift. And so when you're out there sharing these stories that you you are gathering from people. You're kind of like Canada's national storyteller when it comes, at least specifically to this issue of assisted suicide. I want to ask you.
Well, it kind of reminds me. Have you ever seen the Instagram account Humans of New York, Amanda?
Yeah.
It reminds me of that. Like, it's just a random person on the street that they take a photo of, but every single person has some sort of a unique story about their life. And whether, it's the same with assisted suicide or not, to share those stories is very powerful.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask you, Amanda, like for you yourself personally, has there been a specific story that you've come across that has touched you maybe in a different way or more profound, however you want to term it, than other stories that you've come across? And also, is there a specific story that when you go and speak to different groups, whether it be, one-on-one with a politician or perhaps at a conference like you and I were speaking at earlier this year, is there a story that you find that really seems to hit home with others that you're speaking with on this issue?
Oh, there are so many, and often it's whatever story is most recent. Of course, there are stories in my own life too when I kind of trace my history. Just as a personal note on this question, I would say that part of my ability to ask incisive questions comes from my relationship that I had with my grandfather, who left Poland before the Holocaust, but who was a Polish Jew and came to Canada. And as a young person, I was so curious about all the details of his immigration to Canada. I recorded him on video telling his story. And I think that curiosity really came from valuing that was in the world and that I had access to him, and also feeling the kind of moral urgency of capturing that story. So that incisiveness really came from my relationship with my grandfather. But my grandfather, who had been a Polish Jew, also became an atheist. And there were certainly times toward the end of his life where he said, "Kill me. I want to die." And he had his memory very sharp until the end of his life. And I remember those times when there were different times at different intervals where he spoke in that way after a very difficult time. And yet he died in 2015. And so before euthanasia was ushered in, thankfully. And thankfully, he never proceeded with that. Obviously, it was not possible at the time. But now I see the risk that could have cut short our final visits and the deprivation, not only for his loved ones, but even for him, because there's so much rowing that a person does in final hours, final minutes, final days. I was speaking with a friend of mine who told me that even before euthanasia was legalized, her mother used to say, "If I ever lose my faculties or I'm in a great deal of pain, I definitely want assisted suicide." And my friend had been a teenager at the time, and she found this so upsetting. And she asked, "Mom, why do you keep talking like this?" And her mother said, "Well, if I'm suffering a lot or I don't have mental capacity, then I might say something really mean and hateful, and then no one would love me." And my friend, teenager at the time, quickly responded, "Mom, you already say mean and hateful things, and I still love you." I think that's such a good story that betrays our sort of insecurities and our desire to have our wits about us. But really, when we all have limits to our control and what we can do.
As a mom, I feel seen by that story.
Exposed.
There's also a time earlier in the year where a friend of mine who's a rabbi actually reached out to me, and he told me that he was on the way to the hospital to visit a secular Jewish man who was considering euthanasia, who had actually started the application for it. And I asked how this rabbi knew this gentleman, and it turned out that this man had received a kidney some years earlier through a kidney foundation, and the rabbi was connected with the kidney foundation. So the rabbi asked me, "Well, do you have a story I can tell him? You do this work day in and day out. What do I tell him when I get to the hospital in 10 minutes?" I thought about it for a moment, and I said, probably very Jewishly, "Invite him to tell you a story. Don't give him a story. Ask him to tell you the story of the day he found out he would be a kidney recipient. Someone decided to give him a new lease on life and to be generous giving of their very selves for his sake, and bring him back through his own telling of the story and reminiscing about the feelings he felt at that time, what does it say to the person who gave him the kidney if he prematurely ends his life? What does that mean for the future of kidney donation? And honestly, above all, have we not each received in our lives so much more than a kidney? And if we think about all that people have poured into our lives, invested in us for the long run, then to spurn the gift of life is to reject all of that investment of love and attention that has gone into us. It's understandable that we might forget such investments of love and care, especially if we're not experiencing it at the time. However, if we can be brought back to the realization of what we have received, then it can maybe remind us. And so the rabbi did speak with him and encourage him to share his recollections. And as far as I know, he did not proceed with MAID, and I believe he's even still alive now.
Yeah, I mean, that definitely speaks to me because my dad was a organ donor.
We were just talking about this last night.
Yeah. And he donated 4 major organs and saved 4 people's lives, his liver, kidney, lungs, and heart. And it would be interesting if that was the case to kind of show people like our big family. He had 9 kids. The youngest was 5 years old when he died, and we lost our dad, but we were able to keep his spirit and, his generosity alive by saving other lives. And that's the sacrifice that we wanted to give to other people. And so I think, like those stories are definitely very touching, and knowing where the root of that came from is important as well.
Nature communicates with us in a universal language. The sunrise starts a new day. The sunset marks our accomplishments.
The most beautiful communication is where the speaker and the listener match perfectly and understand the same message.
Your future audience is waiting to hear from you. What message do you need to share?
At LaRosse Media, we fashion beautiful communications through our professional video production services and marketing strategies.
Create your own most beautiful message. Visit larosmedia.com and be sure to check out our extended service options.
Dream, produce, market, succeed with LaRosse Media.
Serving Canada from coast to coast to coast.
I'm going to switch it over a little bit because we are a political podcast. So let's talk a little bit about politics. With regards to like specific policies or positions of the major political parties, do you think that the Conservatives and the Liberals roughly have a similar position? Because the Liberals did want to expand it, but like you said, they staved it off to expand it to mental illness. And Poilievre said that if they do pass it, then when he becomes prime minister, he will reverse that decision and ensure that there are safeguards for those with mental illness. But at this point, both have not, gone in that direction actually. Because they've just, the Liberals have just prolonged it, and it actually hasn't become official policy in our country. So do you think they have roughly a similar position so far? And post-election, if Pierre does become leader and prime minister of Canada, how do you think the Conservatives can strengthen their position on this issue to ensure that there are more safeguards for the vulnerable?
Yeah, good questions. So there are so many directions to go with this. I think I'll start by saying that in Canada, we've really seen how the legislation has followed court decisions, and that the courts are kind of determining the trajectory of this legislative expansion, especially with Quebec, especially with now we're seeing a new cases too against St. Paul's and hospital, and the kind of affront to patients being able to be in MAID-free spaces, being encroached upon. So unfortunately, the legislators have not been at the fore so much as the courts, starting with the earlier decisions that we've already alluded to, ushering in the regime that we have now. That's a big factor. Also, the politicians have been following the media and the culture on this. So in fact, it seems that everyone except sort of politicians are really driving this, because we know in the media we see stories every day, every couple days, glorifying and sensationalizing euthanasia. And it's devastating, because normally with journalistic standards and reporting, you would not glorify and sensationalize suicide. On the contrary, but this is what we're seeing. So we're seeing a huge media push. We're seeing the lobby groups and the court decisions all driving the cultural change. And as you mentioned, if many people within religious settings are already sympathetic to euthanasia, and it is popular and it becomes more and more a feature of people's lives and family experiences, it's going to be very, very difficult for politicians to show leadership on this. At the same time, Canada has become a warning to the rest of the world of what not to do. And our main service as a country in this sphere is as a warning sign. It's a little bit sad, to say the least. It's very somber. But for now, our regime is serving mainly to warn about the impossibility of killing people safe. It's just not safe to kill people with some criteria or the other, because we always see how this basically how euthanasia cannot be limited. And the reason for that is because as soon as euthanasia is seen as something good, as soon as euthanasia is seen as a legitimate means of relieving suffering, why would you not expand it to absolutely everyone? Why would you deprive children? If it's a legitimate means of relieving suffering, how dare you prevent children from this relief? How dare you prevent someone who can't consent but who may be suffering a great deal from all empirical outside observation? So these are big challenges. Now, there are some things I still think that we can do that would really change the situation in Canada. One of them and would be to basically have a policy where doctors and nurses are not allowed to raise euthanasia with patients directly. Because right now, euthanasia is being raised more and more widely, totally unsolicited by the patient. And I do believe that if it were not raised, then many fewer people would feel pressured, and many fewer people would feel that they are being counseled to pursue this so-called medical advice that is never actually in their interest, because it's not in their interest to be killed. So that, I think, is a modest and incremental thing that we can hope for, the not having it raised. We also would do well to diminish the propagation, the downright promotion of euthanasia through various organizations and institutions that are very well funded by the government, because this is a propaganda campaign to desensitize Canadians about the moral evil and crisis of euthanasia. So I think it's very important that we stop promoting suicide, that we stop promoting killing. And I often say that the request for euthanasia is not so much the expression of a desire to die as it's an expression of disappointment. Now, this is a very fresh story, but just yesterday I was reading about a woman in Ottawa who committed suicide. And she had been trying for years to get the attention of the media, politicians, and many, many others. And at the same time, she also often rejected help. So there's a tension there. She is definitely someone who would have been a challenge to help, but that's the point. When someone is particularly challenging to help and is making such cries for help, it's important that we go to them. So she had tweeted very often about euthanasia, and then she ultimately committed suicide. She and so many like her are out there saying, this is not becoming a last resort. This is becoming the only thing I see. And what else do you have to offer me? Because if this is the only way that you're even going to relate to me is with the suggestion, there are, in fact, stories of people who have proceeded with their euthanasia death because they didn't want to disappoint the MAID team who were scheduled to come. This is the level of relational poverty that we have in our country, where sometimes having a scheduled death is all that a person has to look forward to. Even in a Dying with Dignity advertisement, a woman who's explaining her scheduled death date, she calls it her choiceful death date, hands to her calendar in the video, and you see that her calendar was empty until she scheduled the date of her death, and then everyone came around. This is not so different from young people who, as a cry for help, will gauge, is anyone going to notice? Is anyone going to pay attention? What do I need to do to get someone's attention? Except now, rather than seeing that as a cry for help, we're actually conceding and capitulating to this suicidal ideation and despair. It is not in the service of the person. That is what we see time and time again, and it breaks my heart. And that's why I've decided to commit myself to the cultural side of it for the time being, because until the culture changes and until we have some serious alternatives to pose to people, particularly those who governments and other institutions might find terribly inconvenient, then we're not able to get out of this mess that we're in so far.
Yeah, one of the things that you were talking about in that answer kind of made me think, I would bet my bottom dollar, unfortunately, even though we have like 50 viewers on YouTube for most of this stuff, but for those who are watching or listening our podcast, right? I'm sure that someone out there who's watching or listening has firsthand experience with assisted suicide and with, a family member or a loved one or a friend or someone who's requesting it or has requested it. I guess my question to you is, that to that listener or viewer out there, what sort of advice would you give them to try to convince their family member or loved one who are requesting assisted suicide to not go through with it?
Right. A story comes to mind of a friend of mine who, in the US, who had a friend planning to pursue assisted suicide. And he was getting ready to go on a plane and see this person in person, which was an excellent show of willingness and support to show up. But he called me before getting on the plane and said, I don't know how to handle this conversation because I don't want it to be confrontational. It seems like his mind is made up, and I don't want our last visit to be one where I fight with him. And that's a very real concern. These are final moments that sometimes people are looking to orchestrate or curate positively. So the last thing that they want to do is rupture those final encounters or to be completely banned from seeing the person. And that also happens sometimes where family members are cut out because the family member knows their stance and thinks that they would not be able to see them ever again. But I said, you can say to this friend of yours, I did not come here to fight with you. I came to fight for you. And I think having this posture of I'm fighting for you and even pushing back and mounting some resistance, because mounting resistance to suicidal ideation is always an act of love. Now, this is the point where I'm often asked, well, what if they still proceed with it and you fail? You actually can't fail. You can't fail even if the person chooses to pursue a premature death through suicide or euthanasia, because you will have not failed to love. You will have mounted the resistance. You will have said, I love you too much to see you go through with this. And even if a person, as we would see it, misuses their freedom, does something terribly tragic, you cannot fail by having loved them faithfully to the end, by mounting that resistance to their suicidal ideation, which is always an act of love. So that, again, it's related to the incisive questioning. I think sometimes as Canadians, we're so polite, we're so nice. When I ask people to tell me about a death in their family, or I point to photos on their wall, some people might think, oh, you don't want to ask about that photo that's their spouse who died 20 years ago. There's a reason the person is, that's the reason, there's a reason that person put the photo on the wall. There's a reason everything is up for discussion for the most part by someone who shows sincere compassion. I've never had someone say to me, you're probing too much, or that's an inappropriate question. Never. I have had people say, I don't want this part on video, or I don't want this part published. Certainly. But no one has ever taken offense at my sincere curiosity about their life. And so I think it's that. It's getting so invested, and it's saying, I love you so much that I'm going to even make you a little bit uncomfortable by probing, by worrying about you, by intervening upon this. And that's hard for us. It goes against the grain. We all are busy with our own lives and our own interiority and and then our own relationships. It's a lot going on. But when we see someone in crisis, it's up to us to be persistent. And that persistence cannot fail, even if they make a decision that is terribly sad.
And sometimes the lines are a little blurry, right? Like sometimes people don't know whether it's actually assisted suicide or it's medically necessary, like removing a feeding tube or, taking somebody off life support. Like, can you give us a short synopsis or even just guide our listeners to, if they encounter a situation, unfortunately, that may come upon them suddenly with regard to a family member or something, and they don't actually know the ethical, side of this, where they can go to kind of talk to an ethicist or consult someone and ask, what is the ethical thing to do in this situation?
Sure. Yes, these distinctions are very important. And I would say that I have often heard from people's stories concerns that they did have a loved one euthanized when, by the sounds of the story, that wasn't necessarily the case. For example, that often comes up with the use of morphine. Morphine is used in palliative care, and also it's important to remember that the principle whereby, as long as the intention is to do everything in the service of the person to relieve pain, to keep them comfortable, and it's not intended to hasten death, if as an inadvertent side effect the person dies sooner, then that is not euthanasia, that is not an assisted suicide, that is actually allowing natural death and doing all of the interventions required to take care of the person. Because we don't believe that people should suffer terribly without relief. This is the important work of palliative care and of all the solutions in the toolkit to manage chronic pain and other illnesses. Now, when someone is dying as well, it's important to know that steps of natural death that also include less of a desire to eat and drink, because that's what happens to the body. And sometimes that can be very startling for a family to witness. Now, a person should be able to receive food and drink, and it should not be withheld, again, in order to hasten death. But at the same time, if a person is naturally and gradually rejecting food and drink, then that's a different matter. That's not then depriving them. It's actually responding to the natural process of death and dying. And there's some great videos about this, like Catherine Mannix in the UK. She's done some great explainer videos. There's also sounds that people will make when they're nearing death that can be very fearful for onlookers. She speaks about that. So it's a little bit acquainting ourselves with the process of dying so that it's not so startling, because all too unfortunately, most people, especially in Canada, their first experiences are a bit too jolting and a bit too dramatic. They're the deaths of our own parents or our own immediate family members. And it's not a great time to start learning how these things happen in general when you're faced with that experience up close. It's just too much. But if we can have a little bit of education so that that's the backdrop against which we live our personal sorrows and accompaniment of the sick and dying, then that will definitely help.
Yeah, I thought that was something interesting that you've mentioned in a few of the talks you did at these conferences that we attended. The fact that many Canadians, and you could probably extend this to North Americans and perhaps even just Westerners in general, they don't really have a great grasp on dying and the dying process. They're not really involved with it because, instead of having, 10 sets of aunts and uncles, you only have maybe one aunt by blood who has, maybe she got married or didn't, right? So you don't have all these, aunts and uncles that kind of die along that generation of your parents. You just have the one, or, older cousins or things of this nature, or perhaps, your parents were older, therefore your grandparents were quite a bit older, when you were born. And so like maybe they died when you were younger. And so luckily, in many ways, luckily for me, growing up Catholic, of course, and in a larger family, at least a larger extended family, that's something that, we experience. And my father is, funeral director, so it's even more so than the average person.
Did you go to prom in a hearse?
It was potentially going to be the funeral limo, but yeah, but I thought that was something that you had brought up in one of your talks that I thought was very interesting, and it kind of gave me pause. Like, well, of course, like, I don't know if it's fair to say, but because a lot of Canadians, North Americans, Westerners, however much you want to expand it, do not have as much of experience with death, and I would say like a good, healthy relationship with death, like previous generations would, of course they would be extraordinarily fearful of it, especially if you're not, particularly religious. And so, I feel like, and perhaps speaking out of turn, I feel like something like assisted suicide gives them more control over a situation that they've never experienced before, and then they're just straight up scared about. Not for themselves, although maybe for themselves as well, but especially for, a parent or a family member or a loved one.
That's right. People are looking to protect their family members from, first of all, caring for them in their greater needs that they might have, and then also to, shield them. But unfortunately, it's the opposite, and these deaths end up very traumatic. I'm also remembering, just on those ethical questions, that I was 16 and it was Christmas break. I was in high school, and my best friend's mother was in the hospital, and she suddenly was on life support. It was, just days after Christmas, and it seemed like she was not going to come out of it. And in fact, she did die. And it was a process of spending about 3 or 4 days. I don't remember really sleeping in those days, accompanying my teenage friend who had grown up together. Like our moms were pregnant at the same time. Like we were like cousins. And then here we were, Christmas break, not at all how I planned to spend it, especially as a teenager. And I was at the hospital with my mom and with my friend and with very few other people. And I was learning kind of up close. Okay, what does it mean to remove life support? What does it mean to that what are these terms, vegetative state, and what does this mean? And that was a lot to take in as a 16-year-old, but it was so poignant and so moving. And I remember the priest coming a couple times to anoint her and to give counsel in the ethical questions, and oftentimes religious leaders will be there to be able to give some navigation and direction. And it was important for me to know that they weren't killing my friend's mom. They were allowing her to die naturally, because unfortunately, that's what the particular thing had triggered for her. And so in that case, we all got to be around the bedside, and I was there in those final moments that everything was being unplugged and we were singing. And I actually haven't recalled that experience for quite some time. But when I think about what things have formed me and forged me and given me a sensitivity to this, it was that process of accompaniment. And there were times where I was tired. There were times where I was hungry, even in those just few days. I mean, I guess teenagers can be very self-focused, but the whole experience brought me out of myself in a very profound way. Like, how dare you not stay awake? How dare you not focus on getting your friend something before you worry about how you're feeling? All this kind of self-forgetfulness that suffering and death kind of elicits when we are sensitive to it. And the thing is, suffering and dying is happening all the time. So anyone who's looking for occasions to actually have a greater familiarity with this, it won't take long. But so many people spurn these occasions and they don't want anything to do with it. And I often kind of overhear in coffee shops how people mention a diagnosis or mention a death and how quickly it's kind of on to the next thing. There's not much lingering. So one thing I would encourage people listening, watching, is to linger on that. Because when someone presents that opening, you can really stay with it for some time. Like, I just want to share about this Uber driver because this one really gets to people in Ottawa. And he asked me, what do you do for work? I'm often asked this, and I always say, I prevent euthanasia and I encourage hope. I don't know what you two say when you're asked.
I work at McDonald's. No, I'm just kidding.
My wife is always, sorry, because he asked the question, my wife is always, I don't know, shocked or just, not appalled, but she's just kind of surprised that when someone just asks me, I don't say like I'm a chartered professional accountant because that's my designation. That'd be super easy to say because I am a CPA. I just straight up tell them, yeah, I'm a co-founder of a political pro-life organization. We work toward nominating, electing pro-life politicians that would pass laws to severely reduce the abortion and assisted suicide rates. And then I just leave that with them. You know, that's now as you asked the question, I answered, and it's up to them and how they want to respond. And most people, when I say is like, oh, like that's actually really good, like great job, and keep doing a great job. Which is actually now to me is a little bit surprising. Usually the response I get. I don't know what your experience has been, but
I've had arguments on planes and such, but I want to hear about the Uber driver.
Yeah. Sorry, man.
Yeah. So I told him I prevent euthanasia and encourage hope, and he said, "Oh, my dad got MAID not even a year ago." That's how he put it. And I said, "Do you want to tell me about it?" Lingering a little bit. And he said, "Actually, I do." Okay. And I said, "Okay, tell me." And he said, "Well, he had stage 4 cancer. He was suffering a lot. He wanted it. We thought he was a kind of ideal case. My mom supported him in his decision. My brothers and I agreed if this is what he wanted. So it happened in our living room and we were all gathered around. So we really thought this was the best case scenario." And he said, "But I have to tell you, it's the most effed up thing in the world, knowing that your dad is going to be like dead in 7 days, then in 5 days, then in 3 days, and then in 15 minutes. And the powerlessness you feel in that." And he was just reflecting on this. And as we drove, he remembered another story, which I don't think he had necessarily connected. But he said he remembered that his father had gone to a doctor's appointment in November and asked his doctor if he would make it to Christmas. And the doctor said, "There's a chance you'll make it to Christmas. But if you do, it won't be a Christmas with you that your family would want to remember."
Oh my goodness.
Can't believe these people are in healthcare.
The extent to which this man decided or chose, and he was euthanized in the family living room before Christmas, with freedom and conscientiousness as some kind of ideal patient to end his life early, is obviously very questionable. So at the end of this Uber ride, the driver said, "I hope you're not going to give me a low star rating." And it was like, "Thank you for sharing these stories with me." And he said, "Well, thanks for listening because I haven't talked about this with anyone since it happened." And that really hit me because we all have people in our lives. Think the people you're passing in the grocery store today, they have stories like that. And there are openings that people are giving. Very often when someone talks about an illness or a death, they're testing to see, will you show any interest? Will you, or will you want to move on as quickly as possible? And most people seem to want to move on as quickly as possible. And there's this kind of, I think Pope Francis kind of describes it as social euthanasia. There's all kinds of ways in which we kind of commit euthanasia socially. And one example that really comes to mind there is about a decade ago, there was this young boy with autism who whose family got an anonymous letter in the mail that said, "Move or euthanize your kid because he's obnoxious, he's so loud." That was put in their mailbox. Imagine the parents receiving this about their preteen boy. And it wasn't even investigated as a hate crime. And that is a kind of quintessential example of how that's a social euthanasia. When a neighbor can do that, when it's not seriously investigated, when that can kind of socially happen. I'm reading a book right now by Catherine Frazee, and it's very intense and a lot of emphasis on Tracy Latimer and
Yeah.
the story of the
We were just talking about that the other day.
killed
Yeah.
his daughter who had cerebral palsy, and how the way in which these stories, these high profile stories, shape the public discourse. And if we want to push against some of these high profile stories, also we can leverage them and I think unpack them, because there's a lot there. But also we need our own stories. We need to be bearing our own wounds, sharing our own stories casually, and asking people, well, what do you think? And how do you feel? Like this Uber driver, he wasn't particularly reflective about these things until it happened. He did also mention that his mother couldn't go in the living room again. She didn't expect to be so traumatized by the event, but how do you go back into the living room where your spouse was killed by a doctor who came in? And so the thing is, we have to, as with all life issues, remember the tremendous grief and trauma and real lack of freedom that people have in these scenarios. People are also very ashamed that they have loved ones maybe proceeding with this, and maybe feel guilty that they didn't do more, or that they're a bad family member. And so we've got to really reassure people that yes, there are limits to what we can do, and we have to always kind of appreciate that people live with their own freedom and responsibility. And at the same time, we have to question the extent to which anyone is freely making a choice to prematurely end their life, and really receive the cry for help that it so often truly is when we get down to the heart of it.
We live in a world that grows through communication.
Every connection comes from a dream to be heard and realized.
To welcome a better future. What are your dreams?
LaRosse Media will help communicate your vision through our professional video production services and marketing strategies.
Start building connections to your future audience. Visit larosmedia.com
And be sure to check out our extended service options.
Dream, produce, market, succeed with LaRosse Media.
Serving Canada from coast to coast to coast.
Well, I think there's no greater place to end off than on that inspiring advice. And also just from our organization's point of view, I'm going to speak on behalf of Scott as well. Thank you for what you do, because it's so important. We do deal with the political, but the cultural is just as equally important. And people need to hear these stories. And it's amazing that you're getting them out there, and that they are actually going viral, and that people are changing their minds because of them. And I think that's such a key aspect in actually protecting vulnerable people politically in our country. So thank you for that, Amanda. Thank you for coming on. Before we let you go, we just want to do a few rapid fire questions we usually do with our guests. Are you okay with that?
Sure.
All right. Who's your role model or someone you look up to in this fight against assisted suicide and euthanasia?
Oh, one of the people who I really admire is this woman named Rita Marker. And I recently read a book about her story. It's called Deadly Compassion. And basically, she befriended someone who had been a leading proponent of euthanasia, but who eventually got cancer and was dying, and then found herself very much excluded from the community of pro-euthanasia kind of advocates that she helped found. And she became a real friend to this woman, and in a certain sense was the only one who was there to receive her. And to me, Rita is this example of having the capacity to always hold room in your heart for someone who even seems like an opponent to come around and befriend.
If you could have dinner with any historical figure, either dead or alive, who would it be?
Yeah, these are... I would probably love to have dinner with John Paul II. I spent 2 years studying him in Poland, And I think he had such an incredible life and personality. And what really hits me is how many people's entire lives and trajectories are changed because of his influence, whether in person or even his legacy. So getting to meet him and kind of see his personality would be really cool.
What is your favorite non-Canadian food, however you want to define that you've had in a foreign country while traveling?
I really like shakshuka. So
okay. We were just had that the other day.
Yeah, that's a good one.
I have no idea what that
with
is.
With feta and halloumi, so it's like a baked skillet with tomatoes and eggs, and then it's topped with halloumi cheese or with feta.
You usually steam it and you usually have it for breakfast.
Yeah, breakfast food. Mediterranean breakfast food.
Yeah.
What's your favorite thing to do when you're back home in Calgary?
Well, definitely going to the mountains and catching up with friends and spending several hours hiking.
Speaking of hiking, have you ever almost died on a hike?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, actually, one hike in particular was very dramatic in Alberta. There was like a massive thunderstorm. We were the only people out.
No.
There were like all these rocks tumbling down, and we didn't have helmets. And it was like the thunder. It really seemed apocalyptic. And when we had set out, like the day seemed totally clear and perfect. And anyway, the photos from that hike make it look like it's on all different days and all different occasions. But that was very, very dramatic, sliding down that hike after several hours going up, and then just the terrifying going down. And so I don't know if I almost died, but it certainly felt like it at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. What's the best and worst part about working on Parliament Hill?
Oh, the best part, I think, was working with people who share our values to uphold and protect life. Because whether we win or whether we lose the battles of the day, that's what really lasts and sticks. And so that's what makes me kind of nostalgic and remember it with fondness. And I think the worst part is, just knowing that. The worst part is when some law passes that you know is going to actually harm people severely. And that is really crushing because, for example, our office received hundreds of emails of people sharing their personal stories about how euthanasia would affect them and their loved ones personally. And my heart breaks for all the ways that may have come to pass in people's lives because of the bad laws that have been passed.
And finally, if you were abandoned on a desert island and you can only have one thing, what would that thing be?
Someone else.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's a good answer.
Now people are things.
No, I'll allow it.
Yeah, I definitely would appreciate any other companion.
Even your worst enemy, even Dr. Ellen Wiebe.
Probably yes. Probably.
Okay.
She could befriend her like Rita did.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Let's hope. I would have a conversation with her and with really anyone. There's no one who I'm not dying to meet and for whom I just want to show goodwill and say that, even the lives of our most serious opponents count, and we're out to protect their lives and their family members' lives too. And that's what makes, I think, our position really special, and one that we can all be confident in.
Well, amazing. Thank you so much for joining us, Amanda. It was a really inspiring conversation. I hope that our listeners look up your campaigns, look up the Canadian Physicians for Life.
dyingtomeetyou.com. So to see the videos and to see articles, other podcasts, dyingtomeetyou.com. If you want to share a story with me, if you want to reach out to me, if you want to invite me to come and speak in your area, as I'm traveling all the time, I'm happy to make a note of it when I'm in your area and come to you, make something happen. So dyingtomeetyou.com. I love hearing from everyone. And thank you so much for having me and for giving time and space for this worthwhile conversation.
Thank you, and we'll talk to you soon. Well, that was a really powerful and inspiring interview. I'm so happy that she came on, and I hope that I've always been against assisted suicide, but just hearing her stories and testimonies and watching those videos is extremely powerful. Like, it definitely reignites the fight to try and help people who I just, like, the doctors always suggesting it or even coercing is just so awful.
I can't believe that those people are actually in healthcare.
Yeah.
Like, it's just, but it's not just for assisted suicide. It's for all kinds of things, whether it be abortion or the way they treat women that are going through miscarriages. That's like not a thing at all. There's a common thread throughout it all. I've wanted Amanda on for a while for this type of work. And then, this past spring, listening to her at those conferences, I was thinking, I really need to get this out there to our listeners. And so hopefully for those of you who are listening and watching, go visit her website and check out some of those videos and the amazing work that she's doing and will continue to be doing, as I'm sure she'll have more of them in the near future.
Yeah. Well, thank you for joining us, and we'll be back again. Make sure to like, subscribe on Rumble, YouTube, Spotify, anywhere you listen to podcasts, so you know when our next podcast comes out. And we'll talk to you soon.
Bye for now.